Right. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mila Stroganoff, Director of Programs for the Friends of San Pedro Valley Park, and today's host. I'm glad you took the time out tonight to join us. We have a wonderful speaker. First off, though, I will mention the fact that on Tuesday, November the 9th at 7 p.m., we will have Dr. Jack Dumbacher back with us, and he will be discussing poisonous birds and chemical defense in New Guinea birds. He'll talk about the incredible poisonous birds, the hooded and variable pidohuis. And they're gorgeous, but obviously quite dangerous. As you may recall, he was with us last year in November and spoke about spotted owls, barred owls of the Pacific Northwest. So we are very pleased to know that he's going to be with us next month. Q&A will take place at the end of the lecture, and Dr. Krista will answer as many questions as time permits. She is joining us from Arizona. So technology is wonderful at times, I tell you. Sometimes it's creepy, but at times it's absolutely wonderful. If you want to post a question, then please do remember to write the question and then press the enter button, otherwise we won't get it. And then, use the Q&A section if you can rather than chat, but we'll obviously check both, but the Q&A section is a good place for questions. All right, so I will just head in and introduce Dr. Krista Kemppinen. She very kindly agreed to join us tonight. And she's a scientist in the Endangered Species Program at the Center for Biological Diversity. Her main focus currently is imperiled aquatic and riparian species in the Southwest. She has also worked on global extinction risk assessments of tunas, billfishes, and reef corals, and conducted research on deforestation, endangered species recovery, and past climate change. Dr. Kemppinen also spent 2 years working with Arizona State University and Conservation International on primarily terrestrial biodiversity and ecosystem services conservation. She holds a PhD in climate science and a bachelor's from the University of Cambridge. So we have a very eminent speaker with us, and please welcome her, and I'll turn this over to Krista. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for having me. So my name is Krista Kemppinen, and I'm a senior scientist with the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a national nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to the protection of endangered species and wild places. We protect species on the brink of extinction through science as well as law and creative media. And we focus on protecting the lands, waters, and climate that species need to survive. In this lecture today, I will first be talking about biodiversity, what it is and why it matters. I will then talk about biodiversity loss and the extinction crisis we are currently experiencing. Next, I will go over some of the methods that I use to determine if a species is at risk of going extinct. I will then talk about how an at-risk species may come to be protected by the federal government through legislation known as the Endangered Species Act. And lastly, I will mention some small but important contributions that individuals can make towards the conservation of biodiversity. So, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity, or biological diversity, as defined by the Convention on Biological Diversity, is the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So biodiversity is everything from individual species, such as the Oregon slender salamander or the yellow lady slipper, to the genetic, shown on the slide, to the genetic diversity that exists within individuals and populations of a species, to the diversity of ecosystems that the species themselves are a part of, such as, for instance, forests, grasslands, deserts, and so on. So now, why do we care about preserving biodiversity? Well, many people who care about biodiversity would argue that it has intrinsic value. In other words, it is valuable in and of itself. The other reason why biodiversity is important is its instrumental value, or the value that us humans derive from it. Biodiversity underpins ecosystem functioning, and healthy ecosystems provide a multitude of benefits to society. Some of the benefits are known as provisioning services. Virtually all ecosystems provide the conditions for growing or harvesting food. Ecosystems also provide a diversity of raw materials, such as wood or biofuel, water storage capacity, and, for example, plants and mushrooms that can be developed into medicines. Another type of benefit is regulating services, and this includes, for example, trees providing shade and removing pollutants from the atmosphere. Trees and other plants can also capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and as a result of that, keep our air temperatures tolerable. Wetlands can provide water quality regulation services by filtering effluents, and they can also regulate the impact of storms by reducing erosion along coastlines. Less intuitively, perhaps, ecosystems are also supporting services, in that the plants and animals that make up the ecosystems providing the services need adequate food, water, and shelter to survive and thrive and maintain a healthy gene pool. Finally, functioning ecosystems provide cultural services, such as recreation opportunities, which is important for mental and physical health. They also allow for tourism, which is important for the economy. And they are inspiration for artists and play a major part in many national customs and traditions. We can also estimate the monetary value of ecosystem services as a way of showing how important nature is. According to the World Economic Forum, for example, more than 50% of the world's total gross domestic product is moderately to highly dependent on nature and its services. In the United States, pollinators alone contribute more than $24 billion to the economy. It has also been estimated that bats provide up to $50 billion per year to the agricultural industry by preying on insects. We can additionally compare some of these economic contributions that nature provides to the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic to the US economy, which has been estimated at more than $16 trillion. COVID-19 is thought to have originated from wildlife trade. And as we continue to exploit wildlife and destroy their habitats, we increase our likelihood of exposure to diseases that are transmitted between animals and people. In addition, when we degrade the habitat of an animal, we increase the likelihood of this animal getting sick. Recent research also suggests that the species that are more resilient to ecosystem degradation and less likely to go extinct, such as rats, for example, are also more likely to host potentially dangerous pathogens. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the state of biodiversity currently. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Red List, or IUCN, and this is a globally recognized inventory of the status of individual species across the world, more than 37,000 species are threatened with extinction. This represents approximately 28% of all species that have been assessed for this red list. And we'll talk about those assessments in a little bit, as well as what the different red and orange and yellow, green, gray categories displayed on this slide mean. The percentage of amphibians that is estimated to be threatened with extinction is 41%. The percentage of mammals is 26%, and the percentage of sharks and rays is at 36%. Another estimate of biodiversity loss is the one conducted recently by IPBES, or the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This global network conducted a global assessment report on biodiversity, compiling input for 455 experts across 55 countries, and including 15,000 sources plus indigenous and local knowledge. According to this report, approximately 1 million species are threatened with extinction, so much higher than the 37,000 or so species estimated to be threatened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, on the previous slide. However, this is because the IUCN has only assessed 130,000 or so species, and insects are also not included in their assessments. IPBES, on the other hand, looked at how many species are estimated to exist overall, and then scaled that number with the percent of animals and plants that the IUCN estimates are threatened. They also took into account the percent of insects that are estimated to be threatened with extinction according to other sources. The total number of species that exists overall was estimated to be 8.1 million, which is at the lower end of recent estimates between 5 and 20 million species, and at the lower end of the total range of estimates of 3 to 100 million species. It is therefore likely that 1 million threatened species is a conservative estimate, and we should also be concerned about species that have potentially not yet been described and face ongoing threats. Let me see if I can move this. No. There we go. Another useful estimate of biodiversity loss is the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index, which measured trends in over 20,000 populations of vertebrates over approximately the last 50 years. They found that the average decline over this time period was 68% for all vertebrates and 84% for freshwater vertebrates. We can also look at bird populations and how they are faring to get a good sense for the state of ecosystems more generally, as birds are relatively easy to monitor, widely studied, and sensitive to changes in their environment. According to a recent estimate, approximately 40% of bird species globally have declining populations. In North America, approximately 57% of bird species are declining, and approximately 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. In the case of grassland birds specifically, populations have declined by more than 50% since 1970. In boreal forests, the population loss has been 33%, and in eastern forests, 17%. For US taxonomic groups at large, it is estimated that approximately 1/3 of species are vulnerable to extinction, and 20% are at high risk. In addition, wildlife agencies estimate that approximately 12,000 plants and animals are in need of conservation action. So far, 150 US plants and animals are confirmed to have been lost to extinction, and another 500 species are missing in action. This means that they have not been detected in decades and are likely extinct. Here on the slide, we have some recent examples of species that are either extinct or have not been seen in a long time. There is the South Florida rainbow snake, Franklin's bumblebee, and the Tacoma pocket gopher. Some other examples of species are the 11 birds, 8 mussels, 2 fish, and 1 bat that the US government declared extinct approximately 2 weeks ago. None of these species had been seen in decades, and many disappeared before the Endangered Species Act, which I will talk about later, was signed into law. The ivory-billed woodpecker, which is shown on this slide, was last seen in the United States in the 1940s. Due to all the species losses that I've just described, we are now globally in the midst of a 6th mass extinction crisis. A mass extinction event is when species disappear much faster than they are replaced by newly evolved species. Earth's normal or background extinction rate is usually thought to be somewhere between 0.1 and 1 species per 10,000 species per 100 years. The current rate of extinction of species is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 higher than the 1,000 times higher than the pre-human background extinction rate, and probably even 10,000 times higher, according to some estimates. In the past, there have been 5 mass extinction events in total, including the Cretaceous mass extinction event, which occurred 65 million years ago and killed the remaining non-avian dinosaurs. This event, unlike the current extinction crisis, was likely triggered by an asteroid collision in what is now known as Mexico, and possibly compounded by an ongoing volcanic event in today's India. By now, you've probably already guessed who the culprit of the ongoing extinction crisis is. Although as humans only make about 0.01% of all living things by weight, we've wiped out over 80% of all wild mammals and 50% of all plants. We've done this in a variety of ways, from destruction and degradation of habitat, the introduction of species outside of their native range, disease, pollution, overexploitation, and climate change. According to one recent estimate, 1/3 of all plant and animal species could be gone in 50 years due to a warming climate. And according to another estimate, even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we could still stand to lose up to 90% of coral reefs. So, how do we estimate the status of a species? The IUCN, which I mentioned earlier, has a system whereby it classifies species into 9 categories, which indicate how close a species is to becoming extinct. The first category at the bottom, not evaluated, is not really a category, in that it simply means that the species has not been evaluated or assessed for inclusion on the red list. The second category at the bottom, the data deficient category, in turn means that the species has been assessed, but we do not have enough information to make a direct or indirect assessment of extinction risk. The least concern category means that the species has been assessed, but does not qualify for the threatened or the near threatened categories. The near threatened category, as the name indicates, means that the species almost qualifies or is likely to qualify for threatened in the near future. Species in the vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered categories are collectively known as the threatened categories. And these correspond to species facing high to extremely high risk of extinction. Extinct in the wild means species which are only found in captivity or well outside of their native range. Extinct, the last category, means the last remaining individual has died. So the species assessments themselves require that the species be evaluated against 5 criteria: population reduction, restricted geographic range, small population size and decline, very small or restricted population, and extinction probability analysis. Each criteria is associated with numerical thresholds, and depending on which of these thresholds are met, if any, a species may come to be categorized as critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. I am, of course, simplifying the criteria and sub-criteria that go into these assessments. But for example, if a population is declining and the observed reduction in the number of individuals over the past 10 years was 80%, the species would be assessed as critically endangered. However, if the decline was only 30%, it would be assessed as vulnerable. Another example, if I can move this, is a species that has less than 2,500 mature individuals left, and there is an observed continuing decline of at least 20% over 5 years. In this case, the species would be assessed as endangered. If, on the other hand, there were less than 250 mature individuals left, and the decline was 25% over 3 years, the species would be categorized as critically endangered. In fact, each criterion will produce an assessment of the species, and the assessment which produces the most threatened category is the one that will ultimately apply to the species. Now, although the IUCN Red List assessments and other assessments that are similar are powerful tools for identifying species in need of protection and guiding decision-making that takes into account species' degree of endangerment, they have no legal implications. This role, however, the legal role, is fulfilled by other classification systems, such as the Federal List of Endangered and Threatened Wildlife and Plants here in the United States. Once an at-risk species is included on this list through what is called the Endangered Species Act, the law prohibits their take, which is a term that covers different types of harm to species, such as hunting, harassing, wounding the species. The law also prohibits the interstate or international trade in listed plants and animals, as well as their parts and products, except under federal permit. It additionally prohibits federal actions that are likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species or adversely modify designated critical habitats. Now, the way that the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which administer the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, define threatened and endangered species is slightly different to the way that the IUCN does, and only includes these two categories. It also does not include any clear numerical thresholds. An endangered species is a species which is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. A threatened species is a species which is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. A species here also includes subspecies, varieties, and in the case of vertebrates, distinct population segments. A species can become listed either because the US Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service identifies a species in need of protection, or because more frequently, they receive a listing petition from a person or organization. Once a petition is received, the agency has 90 days to declare if the petition contains substantial evidence showing that the petitioned action may be warranted. If a substantial finding is made, then the agency has 1 year to declare, this time based on a species status review, whether or not listing is warranted. If the listing is found to be warranted, a proposal listing rule will eventually be created. Or alternatively, the listing will be declared as warranted, but precluded by other listing activities. In this last scenario, it may take a long time for a species to eventually become listed and protected. A species must be listed under the Endangered Species Act when it is determined to be threatened or endangered by any of the following 5 factors. Number 1, the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat or range. Number 2, overutilization of the species for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes. Number 3, disease or predation. Number 4, inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. And number 5, other natural or man-made factors affecting its continued existence. In the remaining slides here, I'm going to go over 2 species that I have sought protection for through the ESA listing process. And then I will mention some other ways individuals and organizations can support species and help stop the extinction crisis. The first example of a species I submitted a listing petition for is the Fish Lake Valley tui chub. This is a critically imperiled desert fish endemic to Fish Lake Valley, Esmeralda County, Nevada. This fish is small, at less than 5 inches long. It prefers slow-moving pooled water and depends on the small isolated spring habitats that have uniquely evolved in Fish Lake Valley. Tui chubs were once found at several locations within the valley, but they have been lost from all but one spring system due to habitat alteration and groundwater development. The only remaining habitat of the tui chub is jeopardized by groundwater pumping in Fish Lake Valley, which threatens to dry up the springs that it relies on. Most of the groundwater pumped in Fish Lake Valley is used in the production of alfalfa, as some of you may know, is a water-intensive crop that in recent years has also been increasingly exported from the Western United States to other countries. The tui chub's last known population also occurs in the vicinity of active geothermal leases and lithium placer claims, and developing these could put the springs where the fish lives at risk as well. The second example of a species I submitted a listing petition for is the least chub. This species is an imperiled desert fish endemic to the Bonneville Basin in western Utah. At less than 2.5 inches long, this fish is tiny and has evolved to survive in springs that are subject to extreme conditions during dry periods. It is also the only member of its genus, which is an approximate measure of its taxonomic distinctiveness. The small fish was once widely distributed in Utah's Bonneville Basin, but now only has 7 wild populations left, plus about a dozen refuge populations where the least chub has been reintroduced. Significant habitat loss and alteration, as well as competition and predation from non-native species, have driven the species close to extinction. At the moment, more than half of the remaining wild populations are jeopardized by proposed groundwater pumping, which would threaten to dry up the springs that the least chub depends on. So finally, here are some steps that you can take to help save life on Earth and halt the extinction crisis. You can support legislation such as the Endangered Species Act. The ESA has prevented the loss of 99% of the plants and animals under its care, but it has been chronically underfunded for decades, which means that many animals and plants are not receiving sufficient safeguards or receiving them in a timely manner. There is also the Extinction Prevention Act, which is a new proposed legislation that would create a grant program for conservation of butterflies, mussels, Hawaiian plants, and desert fishes. This bill is currently pending in Congress. The Extinction Crisis Emergency Act is another bill that would direct President Biden to declare the global wildlife extinction crisis a national emergency, and through that, spur action across the entire federal government to rebuild healthy wildlife populations, require the establishment of new national wildlife refuges and marine protected areas, crack down on wildlife trade and deforestation through sanctions, protect imperiled species and their critical habitat. Other ways that you can help is simply by taking action in your local community. On this slide in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a mural from the Center for Biological Diversity's Endangered Species Mural Project. And this is imagined as a tool to help celebrate local endangered species within communities and promote connections between people and conservation. You can also take action at home by reducing, reusing, and recycling, making sure your big purchases have big environmental benefits. So if you are looking to buy a new car, try and purchase a fuel-efficient one. It's also important to start really cutting down on plastic waste, to boycott products that endanger wildlife, and instead look for products that are made from sustainable materials. One should also be paying attention to labels. So for instance, if you drink coffee, look for shade-grown coffee and choose fair trade certified goods, which also pay laborers a fair wage. You can also conserve water by, for example, taking shorter showers, and make many more choices, such as the one that I've mentioned, to protect wildlife. And I've listed our website here at the bottom, where many more of these tips are included, as well as a website called Take Extinction Off of Your Plate, where you can learn more about how to adopt an earth-friendly diet. In this last slide, I would just like to thank my colleague, Tara Curry, for sharing some of her pictures and materials for this lecture. And also ask you that if you have any questions beyond any you may have today, do please feel free to email me anytime. And on this last page, I've also included some of the references I used, and you can again email me if you want any additional information. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. That was fascinating. The number of I wish that things could be, the onus could be placed with all the endangered and all of the animal and biodiversity. The onus could be reversed. Instead of having to prove that they are in need of help, that we just assume that they need help and take it from there, rather than constantly having to go through these hoops and loops in order to somehow or other make it clear to some political individual or political group or politicians in Washington or any others, or a state group of politicians to prove that they require assistance. It's like things should be switched and put on their head. Everything should be put on its head and just changed so that we have more consideration for the natural world.
No, I agree with you. If only the animals could speak for themselves and tell us how it is, maybe we wouldn't need so much data. But I agree, it is unfortunate that sometimes it does take a lot of efforts to just get a relatively simple message across. And yeah.
The willingness does not seem to be there in terms of, it just isn't there in terms of trying to protect the species, but you know, it's just a sorry state. I recently read Dr. David Attenborough's book, and also, well, he compared biodiversity to a piece of cloth, or you know, take a yard, a square yard of material, and start taking the threads out of it. Dr. Jane Goodall thought of expressing it in terms of a tapestry, and having the tapestry's threads removed one by one, and what is left after that is just no tapestry at all. There's no image left. Everything has just been taken apart, and in a way it looks very much like we're doing and have accomplished just that. So let me get to, someone's requesting that I get to the questions. So let's see what we have. What is the status of the 2 desert fish? Have they been listed?
They have not, no. I submitted these petitions, one in March of this year and one in September. So it'll be a while before we hear back on their status, but fingers crossed they will receive their protections.
All right, and let's see, in chat. Would it be possible to get the slide deck in order to review some of these stats? Well, I'm happy to announce that this this lecture is recorded and will be available on our website. So you will be able to access this once our IT team gets around to doing its magic and gets it up So we'll have it available in a week or two for all those who are interested in to listen to again, or to find statistics or anything else that they would like to go over in this lecture. And as Krista has mentioned, if there's anything that you want to inquire about more definitively, she's more than happy to do just that and help answer questions above and beyond this lecture. Let me see if there are.
Close this one.
Just a sec. We have a few more questions coming in. There's someone who is asking, is there any movement for streamlining the listing process? The time scale may be too long relative to the life cycle of organisms and the risks faced. Krista?
Yes, absolutely. I would say more funding. The agencies are underfunded. They need more money, and lack of funding is one of the main reasons why enough species recovery cannot get done. So whether that is like fast enough or just enough once it does gain a protected status.
Okay. With all the organizations that are out there, it would seem that we could have a concerted effort to move things along. But anyway, Barbara Daly asks, how does the US compare to other countries in terms of creating legislation to protect threatened and endangered animals and plants?
That is an interesting question, and I actually know most about US legislation. Some countries, I believe the UK and Australia, do have, for instance, protections for species, and Canada as well. But the US is definitely one of the strongest ones when it comes to protecting imperiled species. But the issue again is, you need to have enough funding for the implementation of the act. So the legislation by itself isn't enough if the protection that it dictates cannot be implemented properly. So it's really strong when well funded and implemented, and it has prevented the extinction of 99% of the species that I included on the endangered species list. But yeah, just chronically underfunded for decades, and more work to be done for sure.
Let me see, someone else has come in with a question. There weren't many initially, and that's why I was chatting away and giving my 2 cents worth in terms of comments and just overall chit chat about all of this. Naomi is asking, is there any legislation that is slowing the destruction of habitat overall in the constant urbanization and development that we are seeing?
I cannot think of specific legislation. So it is more just so if people were trying to undermine protective legislation or not funding it well, rather than maybe other legislation that is taking precedence over, say, the Endangered Species Act. So when that's implemented, development can still occur, just not unfeathered and, taking into account how the species in a given area are doing and what they need. So off the top of my head, no, I can't think of really other specific development related legislation that stands in the way uniquely.
Is there any way of coalescing a lot of various groups into a stronger coalition in terms of protecting? species? Is there?
I think there would be maybe opportunities, say, for the agencies, so the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, to work in partnership with other groups to protect those species. But again, this is where these efforts need to be funded. And at the moment, it is just so massively underfunded relative to what the species need to recover. So it's, you know, one good avenue for doing things together and making sure that things move along. But yes, those partnerships and those activities need to be funded.
Mm-hmm.
And so the two bills that I mentioned, for instance, that are now currently in Congress, would increase funding for endangered species. But they need to pass through and need to make it to the final stages. And so that's an example of, you know, supporting that kind of legislation that would create increases in funding for species and new conservation programs is a good way forward.
And Barbara is asking, how did you become interested in doing research on desert fish in the US, and what other species are you particularly interested in studying or fighting for?
So I became interested in desert fishes through living in Arizona now for over 4 years. And I just find, I don't know, the landscape fascinating. It is desert and it's dry, and most people don't necessarily expect the level of biodiversity that we have here, you know, small fish in desert landscapes. And so, yeah, I'm generally interested in fish, but also other aquatic species, whether they're spring snails or riparian species. New Mexico jumping mouse would be one. They likes to hide in vegetation along stream banks. So a little bit opportunistically, and then also just from previous research into the environment. But it's nice to do it on topics and species from where I live.
It says, have you heard about 11,000 scientists and 500 Nobel? And I'm not sure, perhaps this particular attendee can complete his thought or her thought, because it doesn't seem to be quite there. So could you please add to it so that I can relate this to Krista?
Cut off.
Yeah, it's been cut off somehow. I don't know why, but it has been.
Press enter and maybe send it.
Yeah, so do send it again in a more complete form. Thank you. Okay. Yes, I was urged to stop chatting and take the questions, but we don't have too many questions, and so I was giving folks a chance to formulate their questions and just absorb your talk and come through with some. That's
of course.
Who's playing music? It's my grandfather clock on the quarter hour, every quarter hour, a half hour, 3/4 of an hour. We have their wonderful chimes. So yes, that's what you're hearing when my audio, when I'm not muted. Thank you very much for asking about that. Yes, so I will go on and see if, I think we've got someone else here. It says here, have you heard about Paul Ehrlich and the confrontation of the toxification of our planet from pole to pole of toxic substances? This was very strong meeting on the stopping of this, I suppose.
I'm not sure if I caught the last bit, but Paul Ehrlich is a researcher at Stanford, I believe, and he does work on biodiversity and the extinction crisis, but I think I heard toxic, and
it has to do, yes, with the confrontation of toxicity of our planet. that Paul Ehrlich was discussing or is confronting, which is from pole to pole, various toxic substances that are out there and obviously causing havoc. I don't have the full, it's also been cut off for some reason today. Some of the questions are being chopped off. So we're trying to do the best we can on this side with not incomplete questions and comments.
I think if you press enter, it says maybe they press enter too soon.
So
yeah, I have to say I'm not sure about the toxic substances one. And if as it relates to us maybe and how we are affected by that. I did see a question earlier about Paul Ehrlich and how I guess the impact of the extinction crisis on us humans.
yeah.
I don't know if that would be related. And again, I think it was cut off, but maybe that goes back to my point of one, like we should be concerned about the loss of species. If we care about the species in and of themselves, they are part of our natural world and therefore they have value the same as us. Like, why are humans important? Why are fish important? But then also that if we are like pushing the ecosystem to such a state where basically removing linkages, like species are linkages in the entire ecosystem, they get preyed on by other species, they prey on others and keep trophic levels and whatnot. That is dangerous for us. We need a healthy nature to have healthy air, healthy waters. And so, yeah, by having an extinction crisis, we humans are going to be negatively impacted as well.
Well, can we even consider that we can sustain 8 billion people on the planet if the ecosystems are falling apart and the biomes are falling apart?
Probably not.
No.
7.6 billion and growing.
Yeah. And Naomi is asking, how does the U.S. Endangered Species Act legislation relate to the UN Decade on Ecological Restoration?
So I know a little bit about the UN Decade on Ecological Restoration. The two things are slightly different. So the Endangered Species Act is about protecting species once they are closer to extinction or just imperiled. And I believe that the UN Decade on Ecological Restoration is more of a international push towards restoring forests and degraded landscapes. So in that regard, I don't believe that it has any immediate sort of legal implications in countries, but it's more of an important movement and program of work, recognizing that we need to not only protect existing nature, but also restore what we've already degraded. So think, for instance, about protecting existing old growth forests, in addition to letting nature rewild itself, regenerate, so letting forests regenerate, for instance, on abandoned agricultural land, but also planting new trees. And that is very beneficial for species and listed species that are dependent on forests. So I would say that's the sort of alignment between the two.
And getting back to Paul Ehrlich, if you see this was concerned about stopping the political blocking of these scientists. A very important matter with our political dilemma. So we're getting, yeah. Okay. Right, and Barbara Daly is commenting on or asking about, can you say what ecosystem in our country is possibly most endangered and in need of immediate protections, such as wetlands, old growth forests, deserts, etc.? Or are they all under heavy impact of?
Ooh, that's a difficult one, and I'm sure people would have their pet ecosystem. They are definitely all under attack, is what I would say. I mean, I work in a desert area, and desert fishes, for instance, are one of the most imperiled groups in the world. But at the same time, yes, protecting old growth forests in the southeast is incredibly important as well. And all of these different ecosystems are being degraded at the moment. So it's hard to really say which of them is most at risk. And what's really important to highlight as well is that we do need this diversity of ecosystems. So this is why, we shouldn't just be focusing our efforts on one ecosystem, but making sure that we have a representation of different ecosystems that will carry on with us as we move into the future.
Okay. Oh heavens. Okay. Do send your comments in and your questions while Dr. Kemppinen is with us. I know this is a heavy subject and a difficult one, but do take the opportunity to ask. It's a sad situation, to be frank, and I think we are all aware of it. I'm getting comments from attendees, but they're not complete in such a way that I think either Krista or I, who is seeing the same thing, can really make heads or tails of, but we are trying. And Barbara is saying, thank you for sharing your work with us and for presenting an important talk. So yes, indeed. Thank you from all of us, all of the listeners, the friends, and everyone who has taken the time to join you in this illuminating talk. I think we have to keep abreast of what is happening, and sometimes we tend to forget in our everyday life just how very, very important the natural world is and how much we are a part of it. We tend to separate ourselves from it and go on with everyday things, and we don't remember that everything is given to us by nature.
Right.
So Bing Hui, to all panelists, thank you, Krista, from Bing Hui.
Thank you for your interest. It's been great to talk to you all. And yeah, need more people like you that are interested in this matter and wanting to do something about it.
Let me just check. So it would seem that I believe that we've tackled Naomi is saying, what a great presentation, thank you. So as such, it looks very much like we can probably finish it here, and I wish to extend our sincere thanks for the time you took and the effort that you put into joining us and compiling such a wonderful, informative lecture on behalf of myself and the friends of San Pedro Valley Park, and as I said, of all the attendees who were present. And we do have many people who tend to who are, for one reason or another, unable to attend the webinar, but tend to hear the lectures and listen to them on our website. So we do have that option, and that's why we always try to record the lecture. And this one will be available, as I say, in a couple of weeks. I always say a couple of weeks, sometimes it happens much sooner. Our IT team usually works on things on the weekends when they're not doing other things, but they come through every time with flying colors. So I'm always extremely grateful to them. So Krista, thank you so much.
Thank you. I
Been
appreciate it.
fascinating.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
And thank Tierra for me.
I will. Thanks. Have a good night.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, okay. So I'll end this. I'm ending this webinar at this point. So do tune in when it's available on the website. Thank you so much for joining us, and good night to all. Bye-bye.